Welcome, everyone. I'm Steve Kenzie, the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network UK. This is the fourth webinar in a series that we've been doing to elaborate the SDG Compass, which was a tool developed for business by the UN Global Compact, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and the GRI back in 2015. It's a simple tool, but one that we feel can be really valuable to business. The fourth step is integration, and we are delighted to be joined by Rachel McEwen from SSE, who will be speaking later to tell us about SSE's experience around the global goals, as well as more specifically on how they have embedded their commitments to the goals in their business. Quickly, the program for today, to very briefly introduce the UN Global Compact, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the SDG Compass. Apologies to those of you that have been participating in other webinars in this series. It will be a little bit repetitive for you, but I hope still of some value. Then we're going to take a closer look at the fourth step in the SDG Compass, integration. Then we'll hear from Rachel about SSE's experience, and we'll wrap up with some tools. So without further ado, about the Global Compact, we are mobilizing a global movement of sustainable companies and stakeholders to create the world we want. There are currently over 10,000 businesses around the world that have signed up to the Global Compact, covering 160 countries. There are over 70 local networks like the one here in the UK that I look after. And here in the UK, we have over 530 participating organizations. At the heart of the Global Compact are 10 universal principles that have been derived from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. Truly universal principles, and we feel that is a really rigorous foundation for any sustainability program in a company. To join the UN Global Compact, we're looking for a CEO commitment, and that commitment comes in the form of a letter to the UN Secretary General, and it must include 3 points. Firstly, a commitment to operationalize the 10 principles throughout the business. Secondly, to report annually on progress towards achieving that goal. And thirdly, to support the wider UN development agenda. And at the moment, that development agenda is best represented in the Sustainable Development Goals. These are 17 goals passed in 2015 by every member state in the UN. So this is a truly global agenda designed to create the future we want. So if you aren't familiar with the goals, of course, that is step one in the SDG Compass, and we have a webinar that covers that. But you can get a sense of it, I think, from the titles that you're reading on the icons, but that's really only a sense of it. The real richness in this agenda is found one level down at the level of the targets, where we really get into some tremendous detail, and it illuminates the important interconnections between these goals and the important role that business can play in achieving them. And this slide is intended to, I suppose, highlight for you why business might want to get involved around this. From the left, pictures of two recent prime ministers, both wearing lapel pins for the SDGs. While we haven't seen a lot of vocal noise from the government about the Sustainable Development Goals, I want to assure you that it is solidly on the radar of the government. The goals are being integrated into the single department plans. They are already influencing policy, and we should expect them to influence policy even more in the future. This is most definitely an agenda that business needs to be aware of. The cover on the left side is the voluntary national review of progress towards the SDGs that the UK government presented at the UN this past July. So it makes for, I think, useful reading for anyone wondering about the UK government's approach to this agenda. The headline over Mark Carney's head is meant to illustrate, I think, further that point that policy is going in this direction. And I think also to suggest to you any notion of this being optional is illusory. He's speaking about the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and that if companies don't act voluntarily, rules will be imposed. I think the Uber headline is sending a similar message. This headline is actually from about 2 years ago, but it just goes to show, firstly, the central role that many of these issues play in business. It suggests that Uber perhaps put issues around corporate responsibility in a box labeled non-financial and didn't take it as seriously perhaps as they should have done. And now here we are 2 years later, and it's become extremely financial as they risk losing their London license to operate. So again, I think this is an agenda that is central to business. The picture at the bottom in the middle is Greta arriving in New York in September, and she was greeted by a flotilla of boats waving the SDG icons. And my point here is really just that this agenda is going mainstream and something that more and more investors, regulators, employees, customers are looking to see business engagement around it. And the final picture, the people in the streets, this is a picture of Extinction Rebellion in London. They might not realize that they're calling out for action on Goal 13, but of course that's what they are. And I could have put a picture up of protests in Chile or protests in Lebanon or protests in Hong Kong. All the people are taking to the streets demanding that this agenda that's described in the SDGs be implemented. They may not be calling it Sustainable Development Goals, but what they're asking for is all in there. And so further evidence, I think, for anyone in business that's thinking that addressing these issues is optional, really needs to think again. Okay, that's the preaching on why we should all care about the SDGs. Now, what to do about it? And so the SDG Compass, as I said earlier, was a tool developed alongside the launch of the goals. And it's quite simple, really. Step one is understanding the SDGs. Step two, defining priorities. So this is an exercise in looking at your company's value chain, looking at the targets that the SDGs contain, and identifying where your company has significant positive or negative impacts. And from that, you can see where your contribution is most needed. We did a webinar on this last month featuring Unilever, and you can find a recording at the link provided. Step three is about setting goals, and having identified your priority areas, we feel that it's a moral obligation, if not even a business obligation, to take action, and action really does have to translate into setting some goals. The key piece from that is the idea of outside-in goal setting, and having identified priority areas, looking to the goals or other substantive external references to guide you in goal setting, to ensure that the level of ambition you're staking out is appropriate to the challenge. We did a webinar on this just last week. We had BT and the Carbon Trust, and they spoke about their process for setting science-based targets. And I think that's a great illustration of that idea of looking to an objective external reference point rather than only looking internally. Step four, integration, integrating the goals, and we'll be talking about that shortly, And step 5, we've got another webinar teed up for the 12th of December, and we'll be speaking with Standard Life Aberdeen and Aberdeen Standard Investments about how they are taking on the challenge of reporting and communicating about their actions on the goals. So integration, really, this is central to the challenge, and for many companies, this is the point at which things start to break down a little bit. Essentially, the idea of this step is to make sure that sustainability goals are solidly anchored within your organization. And we're looking really encouraging 2 key steps in that. Firstly, is leadership and creating a shared understanding through the company about how progress towards the sustainability goals will add value in the company, and an understanding of how that has to be realized through every department in the company. And the second piece, and possibly the very most fundamental one, is integrating sustainability goals into performance reviews and remuneration schemes. It's obviously critical that if the company genuinely aspires to achieving these goals, that they're going to need to align the incentives all through the company towards achieving them. Here's a graphic that I pulled out of the SDG Compass that just seeks to highlight this idea. So you're starting at the top with the goal and with KPI relating to that goal, and looking that in any given department, in this case R&D or in supply chain and procurement, there are different actions that are going to be appropriate for each department in order to make a reasonable contribution. And then from the department, that needs to flow down even more to more granularity to the actual individual workers in that department, and how their actions can contribute and how they can be incentivized to work on it. So very quick, high-level introduction to this. There's lots more in the SDG Compass itself at www.sdgcompass.org, but I'm sure that you all share my view that it will be much more interesting to hear about this from Rachel and the actual real-life story of how they're doing it at SSE. So I'm going to pass over the microphone to Rachel. Let me find her there and I can unmute. And before I sign off myself, I just want to encourage you, as Rachel is speaking, or if you've been holding back, please use the chat function in Zoom to enter in any questions that you'd like us to address after Rachel's presentation, and we will do our very best to answer those questions. Okay, Rachel, you are unmuted, I believe. And
yes, I can see that.
I'll mute myself. Over to you.
Brilliant, Steve. Thank you very much for that. And you've set up what I'm about to say brilliantly, so thank you. I'm also hoping that you will, it looks like you already are driving the slides, so thank you very much. And I guess, you know, we're quite chuffed to be invited along to do this today. Partly, I guess it's an opportunity to tell our story, but mainly because I'm hoping that we'll get some challenge and feedback as well. That if you're based in the UK and you live in a home and you consume electricity or energy, or you work in a company, then through either a direct or an indirect way, you're actually a stakeholder. So as you know, it's always a great opportunity to engage with stakeholders. So I'm hoping there'll be some challenge and feedback. And I guess the objective for my 10 minutes is to share the way in which SSE has integrated or aligned our business strategy to the UN SDGs. But of course, as any good corporate girl is, I've got to start with to describe who we are and what we do. And this is what this first slide does in a nutshell. SSE is a FTSE listed company headquartered in the north of Scotland. We're actually the most northerly headquartered FTSE 100 company. So I am in a very dreich and damp Perth this afternoon. And the thing that makes us a bit different from some of the other energy companies, you think about the big Europeans, is that they have their diversity from the breadth of countries that they are active in. We have our breadth of diversity from the activities in the energy supply chain. So we are focused solely on the UK and Ireland, and we are involved in almost everything associated with mainly electricity, but a bit of more generally energy too. So that's generating electricity, transporting it either through transmission lines or through distribution wires, and we are also involved in the extraction, storage, transportation and supply of gas, although to a lesser extent than ever before. So my next slide is, again, any decent corporate or company worth their salt will have a series of statements of intent. And this is our vision, our purpose and our strategy. And the thing that is really striking about these is not the exact words or whatever, but it is the way in which the transition to a low carbon world has been hardwired into these statements of intent. Now, it is true that our heritage is built on a renewable energy basis. So the hydroelectric revolution of the north of Scotland in the 1940s and 50s, which is an incredible story of social transformation and engineering triumph, and that heritage sort of stands us well and continues to be some of the most important assets we have in our portfolio. But over the last 12 years, really since the heady days of the 2008 Climate Change Act, we have been really focused on investing in and developing assets that bring about the transition from a high carbon content in our electricity to a lower carbon content in electricity. And if we move on to the next slide. Now, when I normally do this spiel and I'm talking to colleagues or elsewhere, I have a number of slides that come in between there, because so that what I've just described to you is who we are and what we're here to do. But there's actually a series of questions of why, and I'm not going to explain the why around the environmental and scientific case on climate change or the public case, because you're all acutely aware that there has never been a strength of feeling on the environment and climate change as we have now. But I do want to talk about the business and the investor case. And this is just a slide that I use, and it's sort of slightly random numbers, but the whole point of this slide is to demonstrate the strategic nature of sustainability to a company like us. And these numbers are big numbers, and I'm just going to explain a couple of them. So 30 gigawatts plus. A gigawatt is a unit of electricity, but it's a really big unit. So to give you an idea, at peak moment in winter, when you've all got your kettles on at 6 o'clock, or when Coronation Street break has come on, then peak electricity demand at that moment will be about 50 gigawatts. Okay, something a bit more, sometimes a bit less. And we measure electricity in hours, so you have like a gigawatt hour, so that means you've consumed a gigawatt over an hour. You wouldn't do that, but maybe the country would. And to give you that sense of scale, 30 gigawatts plus is the scale of what the offshore wind sector will need to be in UK waters. Now, when I wrote this slide, it was supposed to be 30 gigawatts. Right now, we've got 8 gigawatts, but the minimum in the various political party manifestos is to have that at 40 gigawatts. Now, to give you again a bit of an idea, SSE has just opened an offshore wind farm off the north of Scotland, which was half a gigawatt. That investment was £2.6 billion and represented the largest private investment in Scotland. So it really gives you the scale of the transformation that needs to happen. I'm going to rattle through the next, which is half of our top institutional investors are signatories to the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. Now, you may or may not be aware of them, but I'm sure everybody on the call has heard of ESG investors. Well, the IIGC are what I call ESG investors with skates on, particularly for an electric utility like us. Then that 2.2 gigawatts is just to reinforce that scale point of what is required at a commercial level. And then this £15 billion of flexibility, what that means is that, and everybody on this call will know, that when the wind doesn't blow, offshore wind farms don't generate electricity. It doesn't not blow in the North Sea very often, so it's not very often that you need to have the capacity to generate electricity from other forms. But this notion of flexibility, or in other words, thermal generation, gas power stations, there is a requirement for that in the short term as it is, and then in the longer term we're going to need to take the carbon out of that, either before we burn the gas or after we burn the gas. And then the last thing I wanted to say here is I mentioned about our equity investors and how influential they are, but there's also debt investors. SSE is now the largest issuer of green and sustainable bonds in the UK market, and that 2.3 billion is currently the level of green debt that we've got on our books. So this slide, I suppose, so what I'm doing here is just making the commercial case, I guess, that the notion of responding to a societal challenge, which is climate change, creates an enormous number of opportunities. I'm going to move on to the next slide, and this is where it sort of comes together. And this realization, this recognition that the commercial opportunities come from a societal challenge, and the strategic nature of that was properly recognised in January, I suppose. Not properly, we recognised it before, but it came to a head, I suppose, in January, where our PLC board agreed to align our business strategy to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, it is true as a company we had been reporting against them. We had done, I suppose, stages 1 and 2 in Steve's Compass, where we started to understand them. We started to work out what was material and what wasn't. And then this year, we made the final decision on terms of deciding which were the most material, and they are SDG 13, 9, 7, and 8. And then we, in March, we set ourselves 4 goals. So that was on the compass, the stage just before, so it must be stage 3. We set our goals in March, and I'm just going to very quickly take you through them. So the first goal aligns to SDG 13, which is to cut a carbon intensity of the electricity we generate by 50%. Now, this wasn't entirely new concept to us, because we'd actually set ourselves a target back in 2009 to have, at that point, the carbon intensity. We had achieved that. We were to half the carbon intensity of electricity generated between 2009 and 2020. We achieved that in 2017, so we set ourselves a new target, which was to half it again by 2030. Our second target is SDG 9, which is Industry, Innovation and Infrastructure. And this is a nod to our electricity transmission and distribution businesses, which is that this is the national grid in the north of Scotland, and also in the distribution network in the south of England. These networks are hugely important if people, for the electrification of transport. So if you have everybody plug in right now with their electric vehicles, the grid probably couldn't cope very well. So there's an enormous amount of investment, and not just investment, R&D and some clever stuff to be done to make sure that these grids work. Now, to Steve's point earlier about making sure that your targets mean something in the outside world, that 10 million electric vehicles, we didn't just make up. This comes from a national grid future energy scenario that predicts that to be on a 1.5 degree transition pathway, the GB, not UK, GB needs to have around 10 million electric vehicles by 2030. And we've got to play our part in making sure that they can connect. The third target is to treble the renewable energy output. Now, this is a bit linked to target number 1, because obviously the more renewables, zero carbon electricity you're creating, then the carbon intensity of our overall portfolio will fall. But this is a very deliberate nod to our growth strategy as a company, and we have had, I suppose, early success in this from our strategic review and our operating model review, where we were the biggest winners out of the latest contract for difference. It's like an auction for who gets the right to build offshore wind. Now, those first 3 goals, if we achieve those as a company, we will be enormously commercially successful, all things being equal, by 2030. So there is an absolute direct commercial advantage in doing this. But this 4th goal matters too, because we all know, you're all based in the UK, so you will all know the political and public environment that we exist in, either as a public utility or as businesses, and when we've got reduced trust amongst stakeholders. So this point about the fairness in the way in which we deliver those first three goals underpins our right to deliver them. It's like our legitimacy. So things like fair tax, and I suppose we think tax is core of the social contract between business and the society it serves, but also the nod to the values encapsulated in a real living wage. So if maybe move on to the next slide. So that was what we did, but of course, and you can see that at a strategic level it is integrated. But we went up a step further, and while we agreed these goals in March, we also, at the end of the month, the Independent Remuneration Committee of the board met, and they agreed to align those goals to executive remuneration. So this is at the highest level. This is the three executive board members. Their annual incentive pot is aligned to these goals. So 20% of the pot is aligned to the long-term achievement of those goals. And now, if I'm totally honest, personally, I don't think that that makes a massive difference to whether or not my most senior colleagues are motivated to try and achieve these goals. But what I do think is that it gives a signal of intent to our stakeholders that we are deadly serious about this. Now, of course, the next step is that, because the way these things work, as you'll all know, is that you start at the top and then it starts to feed down into the target setting and performance standards that all our colleagues are judged on. So the last thing I wanted to end on really, was really so the last slide is a quote, and it's a quote that we've found, it's a bit of a mantra, I suppose, for us as a company, and it's a wider project that we're involved in, and we're very supportive of a project through the British Academy on the future of the corporation. So particularly as a public utility, we are concerned about the lack of trust between businesses and society, and I suppose these issues of public mandate. And we think that it's been pretty serious for a good long time now, and that there are some pretty radical things that might need to be done to the pillars of corporations. So everything from some of the Companies Act through to accountancy standards and everything else. That is not something that will happen overnight, and you need to do that properly. But this quote has provided us with a hugely powerful mantra, I suppose, which is, if the purpose of business is to provide profitable solutions to the problems of people, planet, with a subtext that you should never profit from creating the problems in the first place, then for us as a company that is solely focused on this transition to a low carbon economy, this mantra provides the perfect frame, I suppose, and in the context especially of the UN sustainability goals defining I suppose the solutions to the problems of planet in some ways, and then how we contribute to that. So that was where I wanted to finish up. I hope that helps.
Indeed. Thanks very much, Rachel. That was really interesting. So let me just remind everyone, if the slide isn't enough, please do type in any questions you might have into the chat box, and I will read them out, or send a signal, and maybe we can unmute you if that will work. Rachel, though, if I may, I would be interested in hearing more about the targets themselves and the process of sort of those incentives filtering down, because I think it's a very strong signal of intent. Do you think there is is it coming that the goals will be more explicitly reflected in incentives for the next level down in the company?
Yes. So if you take those 4 goals, so if you remember, there was carbon intensity, treble renewable output, fair tax living wage, and the changes to the electricity network to accommodate electric vehicles. they're not they're not symmetrical. Okay, so some things are that there's like 2 business units that would be involved in directly delivering those. Some things it is the whole of the company. So it's not, it's not going to be exactly the same way for dealing with it. So if you take the treble renewable energy output through the whole of SSE Renewables, which is the business unit whose job it is to deliver this, there's no question that that's what everybody's job is there to do. So they will be incentivized and performance managed to within an inch of their lives on that. So there's no sort of corporate requirement needed on that. If you take the 4th goal, this is the wibbly wobbly one, which is champion fair tax and real living wage. What we're looking to, I haven't done this yet. We've sort of done some sort of a little bit of thinking about it and how we would do it. But this is a brilliant one for doing something quite innovative in terms of reporting against it. So we have given some signals to the investors that we might do this, but we could be innovative in terms of asking our stakeholders to judge us on this. So yes, we will say, okay, SSE has been the chair of the leadership group of the Living Wage Scotland for the last 6 years. You know, that demonstrates a degree of leadership. But actually, why don't we ask the Living Wage Foundation to give us a scorecard on that? Does that make sense? So the measurement of the impact of that. Now, who would be held accountable in terms of the company on that goal? There would be a vague reference to it in terms of SSE's values. So everybody is judged against a set of values and the sustainability value, but it wouldn't be as specific as it would be on treble renewable energy output. Does that make sense? And then in terms of carbon intensity, there are 2 businesses that matter here. One is our thermal business, because they're the ones that actually emit carbon. And then there's the renewable energy business. So I suppose, I know this is a long answer, but what I'm trying to say is it's not symmetrical and it's not as easy to say these named people are accountable and will have it baked into their performance measures. In some ways, it's so blindingly obvious that it is, and then in other words, we're going to need to be a little bit. In other ways, we're going to need to be a little bit creative. The long answer, sorry.
No, thanks. That's great. So I am curious though, because one of the biggest issues, I think, one of the areas where business is most coming in for possibly criticism with regard to the SDGs is sort of a rainbow washing and business as usual. And this feels like very substantive commitment. Does the thermal sort of non-renewable, is that still a significant part of the business? So does this reflect a fairly substantive shift for SSE?
Yes, it does. So we're in the process of closing our last coal plant. Our objective of our thermal business is to undertake the transition to zero carbon. So that business fully understands that for it to have a future, it has to be net zero, or zero really in electricity terms, in the future. Roughly, we haven't said exactly when, but really in the 2030s, we're going to need to know how we will have taken carbon out of gas generation. It is an end to coal. Now, there are sensitivities here. So if you're concerned about bringing about a just transition from a high carbon world to a low carbon world, then you have to do that responsibly, delicately, and be very respectful for the jobs and the people that have been done, phenomenal. Made a phenomenal contribution to the country for many, many years. So we're doing that in a way that is respectful of that. Now, so the last coal plant will be completed by the end of March. Then there is a gas plant. We've got a portfolio of gas generation, and we are building a new one just now. It will be the most efficient gas generation plant in Europe. So we all know that the country is going to need it for a period of time. What's happening is the nature of that plant is changing, or the way in which it runs is changing. So those plant will be running for fewer hours, but when it runs, it will be playing a more important role in terms of keeping the grid stable. So yes, these numbers do represent significant, really, seismic change in terms of our business operations.
And did you, opening up Global Compact for critique now, do you recognize the steps in the compass as steps that you went through? I don't know, did you actually look to that in advance, or did you come to this point more organically? And do you recognize those steps as something that this is a tool that you might recommend?
Definitely recommend it. We went through those steps. I would say that step 2 and step 3 were overlapped, and we took some time. We practiced almost in public domain in terms of understanding them. So we had a go at, I can't remember if it was 3 years ago, it must be 3 years ago, that we first started mapping our activities across to the SDGs. And of course, you do it once, and it was a reasonable attempt for a first attempt. We didn't really know what we were doing. And then we realised that it was a bit of like, that fits into SDG 8. We'll put that in. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't deep in the way that it is now, but that process was still important. And practicing is having a go, just doing it, I think, is quite important. Defining the priorities, I suppose in my language, I would say the materiality assessment would be the way I would have described that. That was done then. And then the serious goal setting was done. It was done simultaneously with the strategy review. So when I was saying that we changed the purpose and the vision and all that kind of stuff, was all happening at the same time. And the two, ourselves and the strategy team and the businesses, it was all quite iterative, if that makes sense. So that just happened to be at the time that we were doing a strategy review anyway, and it all kind of came together.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. So I think that segues really nicely to a question that's come up around how you got senior leadership buy-in into the strategy and the goals. So were these sort of recommendations that were generated from the business that went up to the board? What sort of leadership did the board exercise around this? And yeah, how did those conversations go about linking remuneration into this agenda?
Okay, so in terms of the board, I would say that the relationship or the board activity on sustainability over the last 6 years has just increased and increased. So it wasn't like there was a moment in time where I could say, that's the board sorted. It wasn't like that. It was much more iterative than that. And something would be done by ourselves and the businesses, and then the board would like that. So even if you go right back to sort of real living wage 7 years ago, you would do something, and then everybody really liked it, liked the feedback that they got, and then that gave you more confidence to move on to the next thing. So you ended up doing some really quite radical things that you wouldn't have imagined right at the beginning that you could get to. But specifically in terms of these SDGs, I suppose one of the things I say is that it's really important that sustainability is governed, but it's equally important that it's seen to be governed. So we created, I suppose, a bit of theatre around this, and some board papers that are a mix of sustainability and strategy. We went to them and said, we think that the way that the strategy is together, we think it would be right to align to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Do you agree? Our recommendation is that you do this, and these are the 4 goals. And of course, that was done in the January, and that was strongly endorsed. And then we were given a mandate to go away and work with the businesses to come up with our 4 specific goals. So and then in terms of the remuneration, that behind the scenes, I mean, you'll all know this because you work in corporate worlds, but you know, the art of getting things done is that there are many authors to that, and I would say that there was quite a lot of conversations between the HR director, the people who support remuneration committee, the chair of the remuneration committee, our finance director, our chief executive, and we did quite a lot of modelling in terms of what that would mean. We looked at past, because actually the previous, you know, I mean, I shouldn't say this, but it wasn't high quality what we did before in this sort of area. What we've done is just made it much more meaningful. You know, I mean, like, every board will have a remuneration policy that will have some elements of values or ethics or whatever, and we just abolished that and replaced it with this, which is much more meaningful, real numbers, you know, really specific and business focused, so not guff words. Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks very much for that. I think that's, I think clearly such a big change. It's almost bound to be an iterative process, but really impressive, I suppose, that there was already a degree of openness to making these moves. Now, a couple more great questions have come in, but we're really running low on time. So maybe a really short answer to, do you have a favorite goal? Is there one amongst the 4 that you value most, that you think is most important for SSE to achieve?
Number 1 is the most material, is the most important thing, is that we cut carbon intensity in that period to 2030, and then we have to get it to 0. There's nothing more important than that.
And then a final question that we can, I think, close on. Learning from your experience to date, anything that you would have done differently to speed things up?
I wish I had been braver earlier. I think I maybe underestimated the willingness to go far and be strong. So I think bravery, that's the thing. I would do more and faster and earlier.
So underestimating the willingness of the senior management to join you on this journey.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's a really nice, that's a nice takeaway. Hopefully everybody's inspired to ramp up their own ambition within their own companies. Rachel, thanks very much. I've found it very interesting. I hope that our audience has as well. Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll be back on the 12th of December with the final installment looking at reporting. We have recordings of the previous ones, and we will have a recording of this one that we will share with you very soon. Hopefully it will be within the next day or 2. Thanks for your attention and have a great afternoon.